The music stopped suddenly. Thousands of people fell silent, not understanding what was happening. André Rieu, at the center of the stage, lowered his violin and fixed his eyes on an elderly man with white hair in the audience. The veteran stood up slowly, supported by his granddaughter. The confused audience watched tensely, and then Rieu dropped his bow and walked off the stage, heading straight toward the man. No one knew why, but everyone felt that something extraordinary was about to happen. Garrison Whitmore spent his days in silence in his small house on Maple Street in Boston, just 5 minutes' walk from Symphony Hall. At 87 years old, he had developed a routine that helped him get through the days without thinking too much about the past that haunted him. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., he got up, made coffee, and read the newspaper from front to back. Not because the news interested him, but because it kept his mind occupied with things other than the memories that constantly threatened to surface. "Grandpa," said Emberly Whitmore as she entered his living room with a bag of groceries, "you really need to go outside. It's a beautiful day." Emberly was 34 years old, a vibrant woman who worked as a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. She was the only family Garrison had left, and she made it her mission to ensure he didn't become completely isolated from the world. "I went outside yesterday," Garrison mumbled without looking up from his newspaper, "to the pharmacy. That's 2 blocks away. I mean really outside, to the park, downtown, around people." Garrison folded his newspaper and looked at his granddaughter with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much. "Emberly, we've had this conversation. I'm too old for people, and people are too loud for me. But Grandpa, you can't stay locked up in this house for the rest of your life. Mom wouldn't have wanted—" "Your mother is gone," Garrison interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. "And she understood why I stay here." Emberly sighed. She had indeed had this conversation before, but she refused to give up. Her mother, Garrison's daughter, had died 2 years ago from cancer, and since then her grandfather had become even more withdrawn. "Okay, but what if I take you somewhere where there aren't too many people? Something calm?" Emberly hesitated. She had an idea, but wasn't sure if it was wise. "There's a concert next week at Symphony Hall. André Rieu. It's classical music. Very beautiful." "No." Garrison's reaction was immediate and definitive. "No concerts? No crowds?" "But Grandpa, it's beautiful music and we can sit in the back, away from the noise. You love classical music." "I loved classical music," Garrison corrected. "A long time ago." Emberly looked at her grandfather and saw something in his eyes that she had seen for years but never understood. A deep pain that went beyond just grief over the loss of his daughter. It was something that went back much earlier, something he had never shared, not even with his own family. "Grandpa," she said softly, "when was the last time you did something that could bring you joy? Not because it was necessary, not because it was practical, but simply because it could make you happy." Garrison looked at his hands, folded in his lap. They were the hands of an old man, but Emberly could still see the strength in them, the scars that told stories he had never told. "That's a luxury I can't afford," he finally said. "Why not?" Garrison stood up and walked to the window overlooking the street. He could see in the distance the spire of Old North Church, the heart of old Boston where he had lived his entire life, except because, he said, his back still turned to Emberly. "Some people don't have the right to be happy." The words hung heavy in the air. Emberly felt her heart break for her grandfather, this man who carried so much pain that he denied himself the right to joy. "That's not true, Grandpa. Everyone deserves happiness." "Not everyone," Garrison said softly. He walked to the cabinet in the corner of the room and took out a small wooden box. Emberly had seen that box 1,000 times, but Garrison had never opened it in her presence. "Grandpa?" Garrison hesitated, the box in his hands. He hadn't looked at its contents in years, was afraid of what it would unleash. But there was something in Emberly's determination today that reminded him of his daughter, of the way she had always challenged him not to completely give in to his demons. "Come here," he finally said. Emberly walked over to him as he carefully opened the box. Inside were some old photos, a few documents, and something that immediately caught her attention. A small military medal, tarnished and damaged by time. "What is that?" she asked. "A reminder of someone I once was," Garrison said, "and of someone I should have saved." Emberly wanted to ask more, but something in her grandfather's posture told her this was the moment to listen, not to press. "This medal," Garrison continued, picking it up with trembling fingers, "I received after the war. For bravery, they said, for saving lives." He laughed bitterly. "They didn't know I let one die. The most important one." "Grandpa," his name was Thomas. Garrison said, as if he had heard Emberly's question before she asked it. Thomas Rieu. He was my best friend during the war. We fought together in the resistance. Emberly's eyes widened. Rieu, like the violinist. Yes, Thomas was his father. The room became silent except for the sound of the clock on the wall. Emberly tried to comprehend what she had just heard. Grandpa, do you mean that André Rieu's father died in my arms while I tried to carry him to safety? Garrison's voice was now barely more than a whisper, and his last words were about his son, a little boy who was learning to play the violin. He made me promise I would look after him, that I would make sure his music would live on. Garrison looked at the medal in his hand, but I never kept that promise. After the war, I couldn't. Every time I tried to contact the family, I saw Thomas's face, heard his last words. The guilt was too great. Emberly began to understand why her grandfather had shut himself away all these years. He carried not only the weight of the war, but also the weight of a promise he hadn't been able to keep. But Grandpa, she said softly, you can still do it. André Rieu is world famous now. He's giving a concert next week here in your own city. Maybe this is the moment. No, Garrison said, putting the medal back in the box. It's too late, much too late. But what if it's not too late? What if this is exactly the moment when you can finally keep that promise? Garrison closed the box and walked back to his chair. Emberly, you don't understand. I let his father die. Why would his son want to know who I am? Because you were his father's friend. Because you're someone who has remembered his promise all these years, even if you couldn't keep it. Emberly knelt beside his chair. Grandpa, come with me to that concert. Not for the concert itself, but for Thomas, for the promise you made to him. Garrison looked at his granddaughter, this strong, determined young woman who looked so much like his daughter. He saw the hope in her eyes, the conviction that there was still goodness possible in a world that had only brought him pain. What if he doesn't want to meet me? What if the memory of his father only brings pain? Then at least we tried, and maybe, just maybe, you can finally find peace with the past. Garrison was silent for a long time. Outside, he heard the sounds of Boston, cars, people talking, normal life continuing while he had been standing still in his own grief for years. If I go, he finally said, promise me we can leave if it becomes too much. Of course, Grandpa. We can leave whenever you want. And Emberly? Yes? Don't tell anyone about what I just told you. Not until I'm ready to share it myself. Emberly nodded. I promise. But what Emberly didn't know, what Garrison hadn't told her, was that there was more to the story. That the medal he kept wasn't his own decoration but Thomas's. The medal that Thomas's wife had given him to pass on to his son when he was old enough. A medal that Garrison had kept for 70 years, waiting for the courage to keep a promise that had haunted him every day of his life. And now, for the first time in decades, he felt something he had forgotten existed. Hope that maybe it wasn't too late. The day of the concert dawned with the typical bustle that André Rieu's performances always brought. Symphony Hall, the historic heart of Boston's cultural district, was being transformed into a spectacular venue. Thousands of seats were placed in neat rows. The stage was set up with the precision of a military operation, and everywhere technicians ran around ensuring everything would be perfect. Sterling Hayes, the stage manager who had worked with André for 15 years, walked around nervously as he checked the final details. He had experienced hundreds of concerts, but there was something about this evening that made him uneasy, a feeling he couldn't name, as if the air itself was charged with anticipation. The weather forecast is perfect, one of his assistants reported. No rain, little wind. Ideal for an indoor concert with outdoor atmosphere. Good, Sterling mumbled, but his thoughts were elsewhere. André had acted strange that morning during soundcheck, distracted as if waiting for something. When Sterling had asked if everything was okay, André had only nodded and said, "Tonight will be special, Sterling. I feel it." At 3 p.m., the first visitors began to arrive. The hall slowly filled with people of all ages, families with children, elderly couples who shared a love of classical music, tourists who saw this as a unique opportunity to see André Rieu perform in Boston. Garrison, Whitmore and Emberly arrived early as she had promised. They had seats in the middle of the audience, not too close to the stage, but also not so far away that Garrison could completely hide. "How do you feel, Grandpa?" Emberly asked as she helped him to his seat. "Like a fish out of water," Garrison mumbled, his eyes nervously gliding over the growing crowd. "Too many people, too much noise. It'll be fine, and if it becomes too much, we'll leave. That's what we agreed." Garrison nodded, but his hand automatically slid to the inside pocket of his jacket, where the small wooden box was safely tucked away. He had grabbed it this morning without really thinking about it. as if a force outside himself had compelled him to bring Thomas's medal. "Why did I bring this box?" he asked himself as he tried to get comfortable in his seat. Next to them sat Wren Calloway, a middle-aged woman who already had her phone ready to take photos and videos. She was an avid follower of André Rieu's concerts and had attended dozens, but she remained fascinated by the magic he created on every stage. "Have you been here before?" she asked Emberly kindly. "No, this is our first time," Emberly answered. "We live here in Boston, but my grandfather doesn't go to concerts often." Wren looked at Garrison, who sat silently in his chair, staring at the stage, as if trying to recognize something. "Well, you've picked a perfect evening. André is always magical, but there's something special about his Boston performances." Garrison heard the conversation, but didn't respond. His attention was completely focused on the stage, on the place where soon the man would stand who was the son of his best friend. For the first time in years, he felt his heart beat faster, and it wasn't from fear, but from something he had almost forgotten: anticipation. At 7 p.m., André Rieu appeared on stage, greeted by thunderous applause from the thousands present. He looked elegant in his traditional black suit, his violin gleaming under the stage lights, his smile warm and welcoming. "Good evening, Boston," he called into the microphone, and the audience responded with even more applause. What an honor to be here tonight in this beautiful city, surrounded by so much love for music. Garrison felt a strange emotion rising as he looked at André. There was something familiar about his face, something that reminded him of Thomas. "Thomas," he whispered so softly that even Emberly didn't hear it. The concert began with "The Blue Danube," André's trademark, and immediately the hall was transformed into a magical space where music and emotions came together. The orchestra played perfectly, André's violin singing above everything, and the audience was completely enchanted. But Garrison barely heard the music. He stared at André as if seeing a ghost, his thoughts going back to a time he had tried so long to forget. "He has Thomas's nose," he thought, "and his way of moving when he's concentrated." "Grandpa, are you okay?" Emberly whispered, worried about the expression on his face. Garrison nodded absently, his hand again sliding to the inside pocket of his jacket. The box felt heavy, as if it contained more than just a medal and a few photos, as if it carried the weight of 70 years of guilt and regret. The concert continued with a selection of well-known classical pieces and lighter compositions. André moved across the stage with the grace of someone born to entertain, his violin an extension of his soul. The audience sang along, clapped along, and was completely absorbed in the magic of the moment. But halfway through the concert, something unexpected happened. During a short break between songs, while André briefly consulted with his orchestra, his gaze fell over the audience. He always did this, looked out over the sea of faces to feel the energy of the audience, to connect with those who had come to him. And then he saw him. In the middle of the audience, among hundreds of other faces, sat an old man who looked so familiar that André's breath caught. It wasn't just the face, though that indeed had something familiar, but something in the man's posture, something in the way he looked at the stage. "That can't be," André thought, his violin still in his hands but forgotten. "That's impossible." Garrison had meanwhile taken the medal out of the box and held it in his hands, not realizing that the metal glinted in the light of the stage lighting. He stared at André with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if trying to telepathically convey a message he didn't dare speak aloud. "Thomas," he whispered again, louder this time, "your son became exactly what you hoped." André couldn't take his eyes off the old man. There was something about him, something about the way he looked at him, something about the object he held in his hands, that evoked a strange memory, like a melody he knew but couldn't place. The orchestra waited for the signal to continue, but André didn't give it. He stood there, his violin in his hands, staring at Garrison, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had defined his entire life. "Sir," the first violinist whispered. "Shall we continue?" André didn't hear him. In his mind he heard something else, the voice of his father, weak and dying, telling him something about a friend he had during the war, a friend who had promised— "No," André whispered, "it can't be." But as he looked, he saw Garrison hold up the medal, just enough so the light fell on it. And André, with his sharp eyes trained by years of stage experience, recognized it immediately. It was his father's medal, the medal his mother had described to him, but that had never been found after his father's death. The medal that had been given to someone who had tried to save his life. "My God!" André whispered, almost dropping his violin. Sterling Hayes, watching from the side of the stage, immediately saw something was wrong. André just stood there, staring at the audience as if frozen by shock. "André," he spoke into his headset. "Everything okay?" But André didn't respond. He slowly put down his violin, ignoring the confusion of his orchestra, and began walking toward the edge of the stage. The audience began to get restless. What was happening? Why had the music stopped? Why was André looking so strange? Emberly felt the tension and looked at her grandfather. Garrison sat there, the medal still in his hands, tears streaming down his face. "Grandpa," she whispered urgently, "what's happening?" But Garrison couldn't answer. He looked at André, who was now stepping off the stage and slowly beginning to walk through the audience toward him. And he knew the moment had come that he had feared and simultaneously longed for 70 years. The moment when he could finally keep the promise he had made to his dying friend. The silence that fell over Symphony Hall was almost tangible. Thousands of people held their breath as André Rieu slowly stepped off the stage, his eyes fixed on the old man in the middle of the audience. The orchestra looked on in confusion, their instruments still in position, waiting for a signal that didn't come. Sterling Hayes spoke urgently into his headset. "André, what are you doing? The audience is getting restless." But André didn't hear him. In his head, memories swirled. Stories his mother had told him. Fragments of conversations about a man who had tried to save his father during the war. A man whose name she had never mentioned, but whose existence had hung like a shadow over André's youth. Garrison sat frozen in his seat, the military medal now clearly visible in his trembling hands. The metal caught the light from the stage and reflected it like a beacon in the darkness. "Grandpa," Emberly whispered in panic, "everyone's looking at us. What's happening?" Garrison couldn't answer. His throat was tight with emotion as he watched André come closer and closer, making his way through the rows of chairs with a determination that was both frightening and hopeful. "He knows," Garrison finally whispered. "I don't know how, but he knows." Wren Calloway, sitting next to them, had already pulled out her phone and started filming. Her hands trembled with excitement as she tried to capture what was clearly becoming a historic moment. "This is unbelievable," she mumbled. "I've never seen anything like this. Why is he walking toward that man?" In the audience, restlessness began to arise. People whispered to each other, trying to understand what was happening. Some stood up to see better. Others remained seated out of respect for what was clearly a very personal moment. André was now halfway through the audience, still moving with that strange, purposeful determination. His eyes hadn't left Garrison for a moment, as if he was afraid the old man would disappear if he looked away. Sterling had meanwhile taken the stage and tried to salvage the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he spoke into a microphone, "we have a small technical pause. The concert will resume shortly." But no one was listening to him. All attention was focused on André, who was now only a few rows away from Garrison. "Sir?" André's voice was soft, but clearly audible in the tense silence. May I come to you?" Garrison looked up, his eyes meeting those of the man who was his best friend's son. There was so much pain in that look, so much guilt and regret, but also something else, a kind of longing for forgiveness that André could feel in his soul. "Yes," Garrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, come." André took the last steps to Garrison's row and crouched down next to his chair, coming to eye level with the old man. Up close, he could see the details that had struck him from the stage. The way Garrison's eyes had the same shape as those in the photos of his father's regiment. The way he held the medal as if it were the most precious possession in the world. "That medal," André said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "May I see it?" Garrison hesitated for a moment. Then he extended his hands and showed the medal. André's breath caught. It was exactly as his mother had described it. A simple military decoration, but with an engraving on the back that he recognized from the stories. "For Thomas, with love, Lucia." "My God," André whispered. "You're him. You're the man who tried to save my father." Garrison closed his eyes, the pain of 70 years of guilt suddenly overwhelming. "I failed," he whispered. "I couldn't save him." "But you tried," André said, gently placing his hand on Garrison's arm. "And you've kept his medal all these years. He asked me to give it to you when you were old enough, but I couldn't. I was too afraid, too ashamed." The audience around them was now completely silent. Many had tears in their eyes as they witnessed this unexpected reunion between past and present. Emberly sat next to her grandfather, trying to understand what was happening. "Grandpa, is this "This is André Rieu," Garrison said, his voice now stronger. "The son of my best friend Thomas, who died in my arms during the war." André felt his own tears rising. "My father spoke of you. He never mentioned your name, but he talked about a friend who fought with him, a friend who promised that the music would live on. And it has," Garrison said, looking at André with something that looked like pride. "Look at what you've become. Your father would have been so proud." "He was already proud," André said. "Mom told me his last words were about music, about how important it was that I keep playing." Garrison nodded. "He loved music more than anything. He always said music was the only language everyone understood, regardless of what war raged." Ren had filmed everything, her hands trembling as she tried to capture what was unfolding before her eyes. She knew she was witnessing something that would touch the world, a story much bigger than a simple concert. André looked around at the audience, watching expectantly. "Mr. Garrison? Garrison Whitmore? Mr. Whitmore, would you come with me to the stage?" Garrison's eyes widened in shock. "No, I can't. All those people—" "You don't have to do anything. Just stand next to me so I can finally keep the promise my father made to you." "What promise?" André smiled through his tears. "That the music would live on, and that those who fought for it would be honored." Emberly squeezed her grandfather's hand. "Go, Grandpa. This is your moment." Garrison looked at the medal in his hands, then at André, then at the stage where thousands of people were waiting for what would happen. For the first time in 70 years, he felt the courage to do what was right, regardless of the fear. "Help me up," he said to André. Together, André and Emberly helped Garrison stand up. He was weaker than he wanted to admit, but his determination gave him strength. As they slowly began walking toward the stage, the audience spontaneously began to applaud. Not the loud applause of a concert, but the deep, respectful applause of people who understood they were witnessing something sacred. André carefully supported Garrison as they walked through the rows of chairs. Each step was a victory for the old man, who had lived for decades with the burden of a promise he thought he could never keep. "Careful," André whispered, when Garrison wobbled briefly. "We have all the time in the world." Sterling Hayes stood at the edge of the stage, still trying to understand what was happening. He had seen André perform thousands of times, but had never seen him so emotional. "André," he spoke softly into his headset, "what do you need?" "Make room on stage," André answered, "and make sure the microphone is on. This man has something to say that the world needs to hear." When they reached the stage, André helped Garrison up the stairs. The orchestra watched in silence, instinctively understanding that this moment was bigger than music alone. Garrison stood there, blinded by the bright stage lights, thousands of eyes focused on him. For the first time in his life, he stood in the spotlight, and instead of fear, he felt something he had forgotten existed: peace. André took the microphone and looked out over the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to someone very special. This is Garrison Whitmore, a war veteran who tried to save my father's life during World War II. A wave of silence and respect went through the audience. Many stood up out of respect for the old man standing there so vulnerable, yet dignified. "And he has something with him," André continued, "that has been waiting 70 years to be brought home." Garrison raised the medal, his hands no longer trembling but steady and sure. "This medal," he said into the microphone, his voice surprisingly strong, "belonged to Thomas Rieu, André's father. He gave it to me when he was dying, with the promise that I would give it to his son." The audience listened in breathless silence. "For 70 years I failed that promise. For 70 years I lived with the shame of someone who wasn't strong enough to keep his word." André placed his hand on Garrison's shoulder. "But you're keeping your word now." Garrison nodded and handed André the medal. "This is yours, as it should have been yours all along." The moment André accepted the medal, he felt a connection with his father he had never experienced before. The metal was warm from Garrison's hands, but he also felt something else: the love of a father who had wanted his son to change the world through music. "Thank you," André whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "Thank you for keeping it safe all these years." But Garrison shook his head. "No, thank you. Thank you for becoming what your father hoped you would become. The music has lived on, exactly as he wanted." André held the medal as if it were a precious relic, which in a sense it was. He looked at Garrison, standing there next to him under the bright stage lights, and saw not just an old man, but a living connection to a father he had barely known. "Mr. Whitmore," André said into the microphone so the entire audience could hear, "would you tell me something about my father? Something only you know?" Garrison looked out over the sea of faces, looking up at him with a respect he had never expected to receive. For the first time in 70 years, he felt not like a man who had failed, but like someone whose story was worth telling. "Your father," Garrison began, his voice now clear and powerful, "was the bravest man I ever knew, but not in the way people think about courage in wartime." The audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. He was brave because he refused to lose his humanity. Even in the darkest times, when we others saw only hate and revenge, Thomas still saw beauty. He always carried a small harmonica with him, and in the evenings, when we thought we might not make it to the next day, he played us to sleep. André felt tears rising. He had never known about the harmonica, had never heard this side of his father. "He talked about you often," Garrison continued, "about how you were learning to play the violin, about your little fingers struggling with the strings. He always said, 'My André is going to make the world more beautiful than we're leaving it.'" The audience was now completely silent, many with tears in their eyes as they listened to this intimate portrait of a man they only knew as the father of their beloved musician. "But there's something else," Garrison said, his voice becoming softer. "Something I've never told anyone." André looked at him, waiting. "The night before he died, Thomas didn't just give me this medal. He also gave me this." Garrison reached into his inside pocket and carefully pulled out a small worn piece of paper. "It's a song he wrote for you, a lullaby he wanted you to know." André's hands trembled as he accepted the paper. It was yellowed by time, the ink faded, but still legible, and there, in his father's handwriting, were the words of a song written for him, but that he had never heard. "Sleep softly, my little musician," André read aloud, his voice breaking. "Let dreams fill your heart with melodies that will heal the world." Emberly, watching from the side of the stage, felt her own tears flow. She had known her grandfather her whole life as a broken man, but now she saw him as he truly was, a man who had kept a promise in the only way he could. Ren Calloway was still filming, but her hands were shaking so badly she was afraid she would ruin this historic moment. "This is unbelievable," she whispered to herself. "The whole world needs to see this." André looked at Garrison, then at the audience, and made a decision he had never planned. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "would you sing this song with me? For my father, for all the soldiers who fought, for everyone who believed that music is more powerful than war." Garrison's eyes widened in surprise. I can't sing. I've never—" "It doesn't matter," André said softly. "My father wrote it for me, but he entrusted it to you. It belongs to both of us." André gestured to his orchestra, who immediately picked up their instruments. They had never heard the melody, but it didn't matter. They were professionals used to improvisation, and André would lead them. "Listen to my violin," André said to Garrison. "I'll play the melody and you sing the words when you're ready." André placed his violin under his chin and began to play. He had never heard the melody, but he let his heart guide his fingers. Let the love of a father he had never known flow through his instrument. The melody was simple but beautiful, a lullaby indeed, full of tenderness and hope. The orchestra joined in carefully, soft strings and a delicate harp, creating a bed of sound on which the melody could rest. And then, hesitantly at first, but with growing strength, Garrison began to sing, "Sleep softly, my little musician." His voice was untrained, not perfect, but it was the voice of a man finally speaking the truth, finally able to let go of the burden of 70 years. "Let dreams fill your heart with melodies that will heal the world." André played along, his violin harmonizing with Garrison's voice in a way that felt impossible but perfect. This wasn't planned, not practiced, but it was as if Thomas himself was guiding them, as if his spirit was present to ensure his song was finally heard. The audience listened in breathless silence. Many were crying openly as they witnessed this impossible reunion between past and present, between a dying father's words and the man who had become his son. "When the world seems dark and hope is hard to find," Garrison sang, now with full strength, "remember that music is the light that leads us home." At those words, the entire orchestra joined them, not loud or overwhelming, but as gentle support for this sacred moment. And then something magical happened. The audience began to softly hum along, thousands of voices uniting in a melody they had never heard before, but instinctively understood. When the song ended, there was a silence so deep it seemed as if time itself had stopped. André and Garrison stood there together, connected by music and history, by love and loss, by the unbreakable bond between those who believe that beauty is more powerful than hate. Then the applause began, slowly at first, then stronger, until the entire hall thundered with the sound of thousands of people expressing their appreciation for what they had just experienced. But André barely heard the applause. He looked at Garrison and saw in his eyes something he recognized, the contentment of a man who had finally kept his promise. "Thank you," André whispered, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "Thank you for keeping my father alive for me." Garrison smiled, for the first time in years, a real unburdened smile. "No," he said, "thank you for honoring him by becoming who you are." And as the applause continued, as thousands of people expressed their love and respect, something else unexpected happened. André did something he had never done in his entire career. He knelt before Garrison Whitmore, there on stage in front of thousands of people, and bowed his head in deep reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said as he looked up at the audience, his voice trembling with emotion, "this is the man who guarded my father's last wish for 70 years. This is a true hero." The applause changed character. No longer the enthusiastic clapping of a concert, but the deep, respectful applause of people who understood they were witnessing something much greater than entertainment. Many people in the audience stood up, not out of ordinary politeness, but out of genuine reverence for what they had seen. Garrison looked out over the sea of standing people and felt something he hadn't felt in 70 years. Pride. Not the arrogant pride of someone who elevates himself, but the quiet pride of someone who finally knows his life has had meaning. "André," he said softly, "there's one more thing I must tell you." André stood up and leaned toward Garrison. "What is it?" "Your father. He didn't die the way I've always said." The audience suddenly became deathly silent. André felt his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Garrison took a deep breath, gathering courage for what were perhaps the hardest words he would ever speak. "He didn't die in my arms during battle. He died because he gave his life for mine." The silence that followed was so deep you could hear a pin drop. André stared at Garrison, trying to understand what he had just heard. "We were surrounded," Garrison continued, his voice now powerful and clear. "German soldiers had trapped us in a bomb crater. There was only one way to escape, but someone had to stay behind to give the others cover." Tears began streaming down Garrison's cheeks, but he continued. "Thomas knew I had a family waiting for me. He knew he was unmarried, that his parents had already died, so he made that decision." André felt his legs trembling. "He chose to give his life so I could go home to my family. And his last words weren't about the medal, or about you learning the violin." Garrison's voice broke. His last words were, "Make sure my son knows I loved him. Make sure he knows that music is the only language that has no enemies." The audience listened in breathless silence. Many were crying openly as they listened to this revelation of self-sacrifice and love. André couldn't speak anymore. He embraced Garrison, this old man who had lived for 70 years with the weight of a life that had been saved by his best friend's sacrifice. "That's why I could never look you up," Garrison whispered in André's ear. "How could I face a hero's son when I was the one who survived?" "Because," André said, his own tears now flowing freely, "he wanted you to survive. He wanted his death to have meaning by saving your life." Emily stood at the side of the stage, crying like she hadn't since her mother's death. She saw her grandfather not as the broken, guilty man she had known her whole life, but as someone who had carried the weight of an unimaginable burden with dignity and love. Sterling Hayes, watching from the sidelines, knew this moment would go down in the history of live music. He had organized thousands of concerts, but this surpassed everything. Wren Calloway realized her video would be viewed more than 1 million times before the night was over. This was no longer just a concert. This was a story of human courage and love that would touch the entire world. André turned back to the audience, Garrison still standing next to him. "Ladies and gentlemen, my father taught me that music is the universal language of love and hope, but today, this man has taught me something much more important." He looked at Garrison. "He taught me that some sacrifices are so sacred we must never forget them, that some loves are so great they transcend generations." André picked up his violin and looked out over the audience. "I want to end this concert with a song I've never played before, because I didn't know it existed. But now I know it's been waiting for me my whole life." He placed his violin under his chin and began playing the melody of the lullaby his father had written. But this time, he played it differently. Not as a lullaby, but as a hymn of triumph, as a celebration of love stronger than death. The orchestra joined in, but subtly, respectfully, knowing this was André's moment with his father, mediated by the man who had preserved their story. And then, something happened that no one expected. Garrison began to sing, but this time others sang with him. First it was just Emberly, Then a few people in the front rows who had remembered the words. Then more and more until thousands of voices united in the song Thomas Rieu had written for his son. Sleep softly, my little musician. Let dreams fill your heart with melodies that will heal the world. It wasn't perfect. Many people didn't know the words, sang off key, or cried too hard to sing well. But it was the most beautiful sound Symphony Hall had ever heard. The sound of a community coming together around a story of love and sacrifice. When the song ended, André kept playing for another moment, his violin singing above the silence. And in that final note, everyone listening heard something greater than music. They heard the voice of a father who had finally reached his son, mediated by the courage of a friend who had kept his promise. The last note died away in the evening air of Boston, and for a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then the applause began again, but this time the entire audience stood and kept clapping. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. They kept clapping until their hands hurt. Not for André Rieu, the famous violinist, but for the story they had heard, for the courage they had seen, for the reminder that love and sacrifice are the most powerful melodies that exist. André helped Garrison off the stage, supporting the old man who had finally been able to lay down his burden. As they walked, Garrison leaned toward André. "There's one more thing," he whispered. "What?" "Your father. He wanted you to know that he was proud before he even knew what you would become. He was proud because you were his son, not because you would become famous." André stopped and looked at Garrison. Thank you for everything." "No," Garrison said, smiling through his tears. "Thank you for giving me the chance to finally come home." Later that evening, after Symphony Hall was empty and the equipment was being taken down, André and Garrison sat together on a bench in a quiet corner of the lobby. Emberly had gone to get coffee, leaving them alone with their thoughts and the echo of what had happened. "What happens now?" Garrison asked. "Now," André said, the medal still in his hands, "we move forward, but we carry the story with us. We make sure Thomas's sacrifice is never forgotten." "And the song?" André smiled. "The song becomes part of every concert I give, so the words he wrote for me can reach the whole world." Garrison nodded, a contentment on his face that Emberly had never seen before. He would have loved that. "Mr. Whitmore." "Yes? Would you consider coming on stage at future concerts to tell the story? I think the world needs to hear your voice." Garrison thought about the proposal. For 70 years he had kept his story to himself, had lived in the shadow of guilt and grief. But today he had learned that stories are meant to be shared, that truth has healing power. "Maybe," he finally said, "if it means Thomas's story keeps living." Emberly came back with coffee and saw her grandfather as she had never seen him. Not as a broken man living with regret, but as someone who had finally found peace with his past and hope for his future. "Grandpa," she said softly, "how do you feel?" Garrison looked at André, at the medal that was finally home, at his granddaughter who had helped him find the courage to tell his story. "For the first time in 70 years, he said, "I feel complete." André stood up and extended his hand to Garrison. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore, for everything." Garrison shook his hand, but then pulled him in for an embrace. "No, André, thank you. You gave me my life back." As they embraced, André heard in the distance the faint sound of church bells striking the hour. It was a peaceful sound, a sound that spoke of continuity, of stories passed down from generation to generation. "Some sacrifices we can never forget," André had said at the beginning of the evening. But now he understood the full truth of those words. Some sacrifices are too sacred to forget, and some promises are too important not to keep, no matter how long it takes. And sometimes the most beautiful music we can make doesn't come from instruments, but from hearts that have finally learned how to tell their story. 3 months later, Ren Calloway's video of that evening became the most viewed concert clip in internet history. More than 100 million people around the world saw the story of André Rieu and Garrison Whitmore, and thousands of others came forward with their own stories of war heroes and unspoken gratitude. André founded the Thomas Rieu Foundation, dedicated to preserving veterans' stories and ensuring their sacrifices are never forgotten. Garrison became the foundation's first official storyteller. The lullaby Thomas had written for his son was released as a single, with all proceeds going to veterans' organizations. It reached #1 in 16 countries and was translated into more than 30 languages. And every time André gives a concert, he ends with the same song and the same words. "Some sacrifices we can never forget. Some voices never die. They remain in our hearts." Garrison Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep on November 15th, 2027, exactly 2 years after that magical evening at Symphony Hall. His last words were, "Tell André I saw Thomas, and he says he's proud." At his funeral, André played the lullaby one last time, and thousands of people sang along. The words a dying father had written for his son, preserved by a faithful friend, and shared with the world as a gift of love stronger than time. Sometimes the most beautiful music indeed doesn't come from instruments, but from hearts that have learned that love is the only melody that can overcome death.